Hey everyone, this is Dr. Rick, instructor for the testing course. Just wanted to check in with you as we are getting near the end of the term. We had you submit a sample report of John Jones earlier in the course, and so another submission is coming up. And so after looking at all the feedback, wanted to provide you with a couple great tips that you might think about and incorporate into your final report, as well as after you finish the course and go on maybe into a training opportunity or into some clinical work, and you might be doing psych reports. And so wanted to provide you with some ideas that you might use there. So first, just keeping in mind there's really a transition from a more formal or academic style of writing that you typically find in the courses, and that changes as you get into testing. For example, with your lit reviews that you typically would include for a post or a paper are going to have references and a reference list, and usually with psych reports you don't include references. So there's just a different style. In addition, you might want to start with a demographic chart, like the client's name, their date of birth, maybe the date that they were tested, and including a table like that is a great place to start. And so I'm going to go through a couple of these tips and then bring up a sample video and show you some examples there as well. So I mentioned a little bit about plain language. Sometimes when you write papers or posts, you might try to tell a story a little bit, use some creative language, and really with report writing, you just want to use very plain, simple, factual type information. Don't feel like you have to get creative or crafty with your writing. You can be really straightforward. You also want to use consistent phrasing. So for example, if you are writing about the waist and you introduce it in a certain way, and you use certain phrasing, like we'll look at in a little bit. Say when you get to the rat, you also want to use that same type of phrasing. And if you use the sassy, same type of phrasing. So when you introduce a test or you describe what it's about, what it measures, you want to use that same phrasing from test to test. That really makes the paper easier to read. In addition, it's a great idea to use headers. So you might have your introductory section, a reason for referral, what tests were administered, maybe mental status is a great section to incorporate at that point, and then maybe other sections like developmental history, family history, substance abuse, mental health history, and then get into the testing. So that can be a lot of information. I mean, some psych reports are maybe 20 pages. Of course, others are less. So you want to use headers so it helps the reader delineate the different sections. Also, another great idea is to use single spacing. Again, when you write academic papers in your classes, you usually have APA style, which is double spaced. But for reports, feel free to use single spacing. It makes much more efficient use of the space. Also, when you are discussing the test results, you want to focus on percentiles and standard scores. Sometimes people start with raw scores, which in a way makes sense because that's what you get when the client completes the assessments, and then you convert them into some standard scores and then the percentiles. But keeping in mind that the raw scores really don't tell the reader much, so you want to focus on standard scores and percentiles when you're reporting your data. And then finally, sometimes it's helpful to discuss the meanings of some terms. So for example, with the waist, we have different subscales. And so be sure to include a sentence about what the subscales mean. You can really get into some lingo there, like working memory. And maybe the average reader looking over the report, they don't know what working memory is. So you might want to include just a sentence or two. Again, it doesn't need to be elaborate. Keep it simple, keep it very basic, but it outlines what these terms mean. So I'm going to bring up a sample report here and give you some more specific examples about how you can improve your report writing. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Rick, and so I have brought up a sample report. You see up here it is from the WAIS, and it's from the website Pearson Clinical, which is the publisher for the WAIS. And so you can find sample reports here, and really most test publishers have sample reports on their websites. So if you're trying to get some ideas of what psych reports should look like, feel free to go to test publishers and look at the samples. So we'll start here, like I mentioned, with our tips. You see they start with examining and testing information. So you have a nice, very simple, clear table. Has the person's name, maybe an ID number, date of birth, gender, race, date of the report, handedness, which can come into play with certain types of evaluations. And then as we scroll down a little bit, purpose for evaluation. And again, as I mentioned, very simple, it's very clear, just a sentence or two. So again, with some papers or posts, sometimes you get in that habit of including lots of content, but really with psych reports, you want to get to the point. And so from there we have background information. So think of this like building the case or building the story. So why is this person coming in? So you have a little bit of some background information here. This is a little underdeveloped because it is a sample. And again, the actual report style can vary a little bit from person to person. Sometimes you'll find a little bit more background information here. This is filled in. Mental status, if one is included, that's usually a good place to start. So I like to see the mental status here. First gives us some idea about the person's attention. Are they coherent? Are they present? Are they oriented to all three dimensions of person, place, and time? So that's a good place to start. Then maybe some other information like developmental history, family history, and so on. So then we get down here to this nice heading, interpretation of ways for results. Right, great use of the header there. And now we have subheaders as well. So a good one to start with is verbal comprehension. So our client here is Sample. Sample's verbal reasoning abilities as measured by the Verbal Comprehension Index are in the average range and above those of approximately 68% of his peers. All right, so you have the standard score and you have the confidence interval, which is here. And again, the 68 percentile. So like I mentioned before, you want to focus on standard scores, percentiles. They also include the confidence interval here. As well as you see a description, right? What does verbal comprehension index measure? The VCI, or verbal comprehension index, is designed to measure verbal reasoning and concept formation. So someone might look at that and still wonder, well, what is that? The sample performed comparably, and that's the client, on the verbal subtest contributing to the VCI, suggesting that the various verbal cognitive abilities measured by these subtests are similarly developed. So you see up here, verbal comprehension index is introduced, then you give the abbreviation and they use the abbreviation moving forward. So then we get to the next section, and so again, you want to use consistent phrasing from section to section. So up here we started with Sample's verbal reasoning abilities. Now under perceptual reasoning, Sample's nonverbal reasoning abilities, as measured by the Perceptual Reasoning Index, are in the superior range and above those of approximately 94% of his peers. So you have the standard score, confidence interval here, and the percentile rank. So again, focus on standard scores, percentiles, maybe the confidence interval, and the phrasing is the same, and it's all outlined very clearly with these clear headers. So from here you get into the subtests, which you can include working memory. So this is another example. Think of your average client taking this WACE and then getting a report and it talks about working memory. Odds are they don't know what working memory means. So here we have samples, their ability to sustain attention, concentrate, and exert mental control. That's what working memory is. So that's a great description. And then down in this section, we get a little more into interpretation. You have a little cognitive status exam, and from there you get into other aspects of the report, which you can see up here is 22 pages. So This is a great place to end our tutorial. There's more to look at, of course, if you want. You go down here, here's the tables, and you have some charts, and then you'd have recommendations like was asked in the initial report. So hopefully this gives you a great idea of what reports look like, and these are some great tips you can incorporate into your final report. Thanks very much.